Well, we are joined this time by Brian McLaren and Tim Whitaker. Our listeners are very familiar with Brian McLaren, and I bet they're probably familiar with Tim Whitaker from the New Evangelicals podcast as well. And we're all here together at Theology Beer Camp, and this is a very impromptu, kind of last-minute gathering conversation. We're going to reflect on some of the stuff
People
that we've
say
all been
those
hearing.
words when they don't really mean it, but we mean it.
No, we mean it. This was thrown together in the last 2 minutes, almost.
I'm literally reading name tags. Yeah. Okay, that's where I'm at in this conversation.
Yeah. Tim and I are probably cousins from some distant relation.
Probably.
Have a lot of overlaps and are really excited to be talking together here with Brian McLaren. So my first question, and I just want to put this out there for whoever wants to address it, is what has your experience been like at Theology Beer Camp so far, and what talks or conversations have really stood out to you the most?
Well, I'll go first. I have never been to it before, and I expected it to be fun and high energy, and it's been more fun and higher energy. So much so that when I went back to my room last night, I crashed. I was asleep by 9 o'clock, but it's been great.
Yeah. How about you, Tim?
It's been great. This is my third year. First year was right after the pandemic. I had no clue what I was in for. TNE, the New Evangelicals, was pretty new. I mean, it's still new, but it was really new then. I just heard about all these names and had no clue what I was going to walk into. First time hearing about people like Tom Ord or Aaron Simmons and Diana Butler-Bass. So it was great. But yeah, being here and seeing the evolution of the even just the quality of like the conference, how organized it is, thanks to Kristen and Sari. It's been really nice, and it's just so great not talking into a microphone alone. Yeah. It's great having people in the same room. You can't replicate that anywhere digitally.
No, yeah. Zoom is a gift, but yes. I'm glad to break out of its constructs for sure.
Amen.
Yes. So, Brian, you were just featured for a little bit in one of the sessions, but also in a new podcast called Emerging, is it?
Emerged.
So, friends, listeners, check that out. You're going to like it. It's kind of, my take on it from an hour listening was it's similar to the rise and fall of Mars Hill Church, but in a more generous way towards the emerging church movements. Is that about it?
Yeah, it's similar in that it's not an ongoing podcast. I forget how many episodes
Correct.
it is, but it's what did he call it? Oral history, I think.
Yeah. So that just got me thinking in ways of you. I don't want to figure out another way to call you old, Brian, but you're kind of
I'm not bothered by their title.
You're kind of an elder statesman of this progressive Christian movement, if you will. I don't even know if we have a name for what we are, but it used to be the emerging church. And it just got me thinking of how you have been ministering, whether it began as a pastor into author and writer, speaker, and you've gone before us in many ways, before Tim in many ways, I'm sure before us for sure, and even pastorally, I see you kind of as someone who's a trailblazer in many ways. So could you just take us through, without boring yourself too much, just those iterations of ministry, church life, and the nuances that came with and the shifts that were born, maybe about when they were born, what that did to you. I would just love to hear the last 30 years, maybe of American church history told through the lens of Brian McLaren. How's that?
Goodness, okay.
You have 1 minute.
Well, let me start by saying I was born fundamentalist. We saw Southern Baptists as being kind of liberal, and we were more biblical than anybody. The good side of that was I really learned the Bible. The not so good side of it was that I was given a very strict list of questions that I was not allowed to ask. And so by the time I was a teenager, I thought I was on the way out of this thing. I remember being like 14 and thinking 4 more years and I am so out of here. I ended up having a kind of very powerful spiritual experience in those years that was not in church, and I think that was probably a good thing. It was, and that kept me in the Christian faith. I was involved with the Jesus movement in the 70s. My career goal was to be a college English teacher. I loved literature. Interestingly, I think all of my Bible experience had given me a sensitivity to literature. People don't realize that a lot of Bible study is kind of literary analysis sometimes.
Almost accidental at that point, maybe?
We wouldn't have ever said it that way. But I was actually learning how to read literature. Yeah. Sometimes bad ways to read literature, but the literature I was reading was real literature. And so I was in graduate school. In the Jesus Movement years, I'd been part of a new church plant, and that ended with a lot of pain. I said, I'll never do that again. I was in graduate school. We started a little house group, ended up becoming a church. And
this is in Baltimore area?
This is in the D.C. area, Maryland, yeah. And I was a college English teacher for several years, and I was leading the church while I was teaching, and then left teaching to be a pastor full time.
What years are these? Do you mind me asking?
So from about 1980 to let's see. I'm so bad with numbers.
General is fine.
I was a pastor until 2006. Go back 24 years from 2006.
Got
and
it.
those were the years I was a pastor. So 1990, 1988, something like that. Yeah. Actually, I think the church began in 1982, and then I probably left teaching over from 1986 to 88 or 89. Yeah. So so we were kind of an interesting church. We began with a mix of evangelicals and charismatics, which was sort of rare in those days, and folks interested in social justice. My co-founder of the church had been really involved with Sojourners, if you're familiar with that. So we were an odd mix, and it was a beautiful experimental community.
And were you non-affirming in the beginning?
Well, this wasn't even a question.
That wasn't even a question.
And it's hard for people to imagine, but first of all, I jokingly say in my church growing up, I never heard a sermon on homosexuality. I don't think I ever heard the term mentioned, but we never mentioned sexuality, right? I remember being a boy and hearing about circumcision, and I said to my mother, "What does that mean?" And when she told me that these Bible verses are talking about an operation on the penis, I thought, this is so indecent.
I'm done with Christianity.
This is so wrong, But so that it wasn't even a question. We had gay people part of our church all the way through. On that we could talk more about that issue if you want, but that just wasn't an issue. It became an issue.
I'm just trying to get at what were the waters like that you were swimming in as you started the church?
Yeah.
Theologically or movementally.
Yeah. So because I was a lit major, I feel I had this wonderful advantage when I would open the Bible. I wasn't looking for rules to impose on people. I wasn't looking for doctrines to fight about, and I was looking for meaning. I'd learned that through my lit studies, and so we attracted a wide array of people, and then and eventually that became a problem because in the 80s, as the religious right began to form into the early 90s, what I realized is people that we were bringing into a very loving and generous and inclusive Christian faith were then turning on Christian radio and being sucked into something that we were trying to get as far away from as we could.
Christian radio was such an influence in the 80s and 90s,
my
evangelical church, right?
Tim,
feel free to ask. Jump in.
I don't really have anything. I'm just listening. It's great.
Yeah. No, I just want to let you. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. But no, it's wonderful. Really helpful.
Yeah. So, and I remember really feeling it about 1990. I felt like, oh man, the tide is turning, and these people are becoming mean. I was in this pastors group, interdenominational pastors group. A lot of them were charismatic, and they became. And I met a lot of the key players in what became the new apostolic reformation.
Wow.
They were not that political back then, at least not overtly, but I felt it. And I remember thinking, these people are more fundamentalist than the fundamentalists that I grew up with.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Are you talking about you were hanging out with Peter Wagner, Lance Wallnau, folks like that?
I never met Lance Wallnau, but I heard Peter Wagner speak many times before the New Apostolic thing began. And then when I heard that he got involved with that, I just thought, he was way too nice a guy to get involved with that. Wow. But
So it's 1990. You're realizing for the first time these people are getting mean, it feels like.
It felt like they were getting mean. And the other thing that was happening around 1990 is we had this big influx of people who came to faith at our church. A lot of them were from the recovery community. Mm-hmm. And I just realized the gap between normal people and, you know, my background is in higher education, so I would never want to have a church that my students couldn't come to. Mm-hmm. I'd never want to have a church that my fellow faculty couldn't come to. And I realized the gap that they you know, it was the beginning of the polarization. Yeah. I could feel that we were going to have to make some tough choices.
So how did the emerging church movement factor into all that? What was the context, and what do you think? My impression is that it was not effective. So what do you think happened that lost out on its original vision? And then connected with that, does that give you any one of the questions I wanted to ask you was, do you see any like red flags or concerns about the progressive theology movement that this fest kind of embodies, that podcasts like ours and like Tim's embody? Do you see anything that we should be looking out for that you might have learned from that emerging experience?
So here's the interesting thing. When this thing formed, I'd written my first book in 1998. It was called The Church on the Other Side. And this emergent group had advertised, they didn't have that name emergent then. They advertised a conference and they used the word postmodern in it. Well, I was in graduate school when the word postmodern first really entered the American vocabulary through English departments, because it came in through literary criticism and things like this. So I was familiar with this term. I had been very interested in this term in 1978. And
Elder statesman.
And what I felt in the early 90s was that what I had read about and been exposed to in graduate school was on the street in the 90s. Mm-hmm. And so I was trying to lead our church into making the choice to not try to keep the conservative religious people happy, but to try to learn to speak the language of this emerging postmodern culture. Mm-hmm. And when I got this, I saw some advertisement for this conference, and they used the word postmodern. I had just written my first book in 1998, and I sent them the book and said, if you're looking for somebody to talk about this sort of thing, and they invited me to come. And so the word postmodern was a word that helped us it gave us permission to say what we see going on in Christianity doesn't look right to us. And it allowed us to say there could be another way of being Christian.
Was that a pushback on the evangelical megachurch explosion of the 90s, or what was that? What was it doesn't have to be this way or shouldn't be this way? What was that critiquing?
Yeah, it's interesting because in some ways, this is ancient history for a lot of people, right? But when the megachurch movement happened, one of the key megachurches was a guy named Robert Schuller. And a lot of people criticize Robert Schuller for a lot of things, but...
Is that the Crystal Cathedral?
The Crystal Cathedral.
Yeah.
There's a lot to mock, and there's a lot to feel very silly about with some of that. But they were interested in removing barriers to people becoming people of faith. And so in many ways, megachurches were way more open than the little fundamentalist church down the street, where most of the people who came to megachurches were coming from little fundamentalist churches. Yes. I remember, here's the way I'd say it. Like a good example today of a megachurch pastor is Joel Osteen, right? Mm-hmm. And look, I could bet that a whole lot of people going to Joel Osteen's church, before they went to his church, they went to a little Pentecostal church or a little Southern Baptist church where every Sunday the preacher told them who to hate. Yeah. And they come to Joel Osteen's church, and he isn't telling them to hate anybody. Like, that's a big step in the right direction, Yes. Obviously, there's a lot about Joel Osteen's work that sends shivers up my spine, but I can appreciate that he was not inviting people into hate. And if we could just move toward love, that seemed to me like a good thing. But The truth was, there was this political movement. I was in Washington, D.C. area, so it was in my blood to be sensitive to this. But I could tell that the evangelical and conservative Catholic world was becoming the client of a right-wing, white supremacist, anti-environmental, billionaire, bought and paid for form of Christianity.
Yeah. You saw that before most of it. Like, I was too young. I wasn't too young. I feel like you and some others saw that before most of us had eyes to see it.
And here's, maybe I don't want to present myself as being smarter or more insightful. Here's the way I describe it. There's something called baseline syndrome, in psychology and in sociology. When you come of age, when you become conscious of the world, that's normal. Mm-hmm. And you assume that that's been the norm for a long time. Mm-hmm. And then you're able to judge the rest of your life based on that norm. Well, I just had, a few extra decades of data to compare. I had a different baseline. So for someone, when you came along, evangelical already meant a set of things that it didn't mean when I first came along. Yeah. Mm.
So you're in any follow-up questions?
Yeah, can just go back to the emerging church thing for a second. If that's what it was reacting against, and there was a lot of life in that and a lot of vision in that, what happened? Yeah.
So it's interesting. Let's get back to your question that you asked. In my mind, that emergent movement accomplished far more in 8 or 9 years than I thought it would accomplish in my entire lifetime. So for me, our goal, I never believed that we would convince very many people. I just wanted us to get a hearing. And I just wanted us to be able to get questions on the table. So I felt that we succeeded beyond wildest imagination because we got issues on the table.
That's totally fair.
Yeah.
So thinking about the context we're in now, again, at this kind of progressive theology space, for a lack of a better term to describe it, does it seem more radical to you than what you guys were doing then?
Well, what we were doing changed a lot in 8 or 9 years, because when we started, we were focused mainly on issues of culture, music, style, leadership style, emphases, needs. We were focused on issues of culture, but I, from the beginning, said, this is deeper than culture. This is also about philosophy and theology. And so those were issues we were talking about. In fact, before it was called Emergent, we called it the Terra Nova Theology Project. And we created spaces where evangelical, mainline Protestant, and Roman Catholic leaders could come together, and we could talk about things that couldn't be talked about in other spaces.
So Kyle wants to know, like, the ethos or the content of the movement. I want to know what it felt like when you were in those when that conversation was live. And you have other peers now who are thinking the same thoughts you are, not exactly the same. What did that feel like in you?
It felt like huge permission. I remember being in the back of a car with a guy who and we're both preachers, right? And he said, I'm trying to preach on whatever it was, I'm trying to preach on such and such book in the Bible. It makes no sense to me. I think it's kind of evil, to tell you the truth. And I just remember feeling, we're allowed to say that in the back of this car. We're allowed to say that. And he wasn't saying, let's throw out the Bible, but he was saying, I need to be honest about how this seems when I'm actually trying to preach it to people today. So there was a feeling of liberation. And then we did constructive things, and in the sense that we would bring these gatherings together, and we would, and what's interesting, we're here at this thing with Homebrewed Christianity. Well, Tripp Fuller has made this stuff because of the advances of the internet and podcasts and so on. What Tripp has done is made access to our greatest living theologians available to tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, and maybe millions of people a year around the world instantly, Well, we were trying to do the same thing. In fact, that's how I met Tripp. I was out, and doing something, and was very impressed with this young guy. But, for example, we had a meeting with I think one of our really important living theologians, a woman named Nancy Murphy. And we went to California where she lived. We said, you don't have to give talks. We're going to read a couple of your books. And would you just let us come and ask questions and talk to you for a couple of days? And so it was just a thrilling thing.
Like some of us do for you now.
Well, it was the need for, yeah. And,
Yes.
and I'll tell you what was so interesting. At the end of it, Nancy and I had lunch. And she said, this is one of the most stimulating situations I've ever been in. She said, I'd love to be invited again. But if you invite me again, instead of asking me questions, could I just ask you questions? Because you're practicing things I'm talking about in theory, and the dialogue of theory and practice is where breakthroughs happen.
Yes, some friends of ours that we've spoken to, Samir and Sherad Yadav. Is that how you say their last name? They're twin brothers. One's a pastor and the other's a theologian, studied under Hauerwas. And Sherad, the pastor, will say, or former pastor now, will say, my brother works for me. Like, theology works for the pastors. We're the ones doing the work. They're telling us, and I like that, not just because I'm a pastor, but kind of talking about what you're speaking to is, I have these ideas and I have these thoughts and concepts, but I want to hear how it's actually working out in real time.
Yes, and like you, these were pastors who were learning from their congregations.
Yeah.
They weren't just there to figure out how do I squeeze my congregation into the mold that somebody else. They were learning from them. And this is where issues of sexuality, in the late 90s and early 2000s, I remember, being at events like this and people are sitting around at tables, and long before anybody talked about the issue of transgender, I remember sitting with a pastor and said, and believe me, this just wasn't talked about yet, right?
Yes.
But I remember a pastor telling me, we just set up another bathroom that is a non-gender bathroom. In other words,
When was this?
This is maybe 2003, 2004. And this was not an issue that, there was discussion about bathrooms.
Yeah. No.
It was a practical issue because they had a number of transgendered people and they didn't feel comfortable which bathroom they should go in. So they set aside another bathroom. So, when that became an issue 15 years later, I just remember thinking, real life was confronting folks with these things, not as issues, but as with neighbors, with people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you were pastoring still when you made the switch from non-affirming to affirming, correct?
So we had a lot of gay folk in our church, and it just wasn't an issue. Except, could I tell a quick story about this? So I'll never forget. One Sunday afternoon, came home from church, took a nap, as I often did, and for some reason checked my email. Email's in my inbox.
I never do that after Sunday.
Email is in my inbox. Dear Brian, I've been coming to your church, to Cedar Ridge Community Church. Wonderful church, still going, doing beautiful work. I've been coming to Cedar Ridge, for whatever it was, 2.5 years. I've never met you. I usually arrive a little late and leave immediately after. She said, I never realized how much this church mattered to me until today, my last Sunday. And then she said, I'm lesbian, my partner and I come. And she said, I have never for a second doubted that we were welcome until today. And now that I realize maybe we have never been welcome here, I just wanted to write and thank you that it's been a great experience. And so, of course, I wrote back to her and I said, what happened? Can we talk? So we met the next day. And there was a fellow in our church who had come to faith at our church. He had been kind of a secular, graduate student, come to faith. And he had prayed in a prayer. He'd been delivered a kind of a prayer that was part of our liturgy. But it was a spontaneous prayer. And he was being influenced by this thing back then that was called Promise Keepers, right?
Yeah.
And I didn't realize it, but he had picked up some of their language. And I probably wasn't listening, to tell you the truth, when he prayed. But when she heard some of that code language, she just said her skin crawled, because she knew that was language that was used to say people like you aren't welcome. So I said to her, listen, you are welcome. And so I went back to my leadership team and I said, we got to make a choice. We're either going to offend this guy and he's going to leave the church, or we're going to drive away people like this couple. I said, we got to make a choice. Who are we more willing to drive away? And so our leadership team then would have been had a wide spectrum from, on LGBT equality. But everybody agreed. There are plenty of churches for a Promise Keeper guy to go to,
Yes.
and not many for this couple to go to. So, I had a talk with him, and sure enough, a couple years later, he left, and it was heartbreaking because, I had helped him come to faith. And,
Yeah. Can I go back to my radicalism question a
yeah.
little bit? And I want, Tim, this will be a little bit for you as well. The reason I asked it, so I've been struck during this conference by how broad the tent is here,
Yes.
both in terms of Christian identity, doctrinal affiliation, traditional affiliation, but also in terms of, particularly highlighting the last talk I heard, interreligious affiliation
Yes.
and interest. So you're talking about back then, you guys were wondering, can I say something in the Bible is bad, right?
Yeah.
But now we've got stats like one of the speakers, John Tatamano, who cited 35% of Americans say they attend religious services in more than one place. 24% of those are interreligious space, non-Christian. 20% of Americans are raised in religiously mixed households, he said. And when he asked the audience, how many of you participate in interreligious practices, like half or more of the room raised their hand.
But yeah, a lot.
It was a lot. Almost everyone here seems, that I've talked to, completely comfortable with that idea, with spiritual fluidity, as he called it, exploring truth in heterodox Christian strains or even outside Christian theism altogether. Tripp Fuller is famously process theologian, not his orthodox Christian theism necessarily. We heard about Hindu traditions and influences not long ago. Do you think this, I'm calling it more radical, I want to know if you guys agree with that. Is this a bubble? Do you think this portends something more significant in American religion?
Yeah. So let me just, going back to your question about the whole emerging movement, one of our early conferences, I'll never forget, because this was super meaningful for me. One of our breakout sessions, or it might have been one of our main sessions, was a fellow from the Philippines who was brought up Southern Baptist in the Philippines, moved to Canada, said, I'm an Asian. I know more about Plato and Aristotle than I do about my own religious heritage in Asia. So he became a student of Tai Chi and of Taoism, and he integrated them. And so at that conference, he led us in Tai Chi and explained how he integrated those in his own life. And I just remember feeling that day, this is right, this is good for us. So those conversations, I think, have been happening. I was invited to speak at a Catholic university some years ago. And one of the other presenters was a Vietnamese fellow named Peter Phan. Peter Phan is a very respected Catholic theologian. His life's work has been about the integration of Catholic theology and Buddhism. And he had a job at a major Catholic university, but we had a conversation, and he told me he'd gotten a letter from the Vatican saying they wanted to investigate him, right? So these things are happening across the board, and there's pushback to them. Yeah. So you might say it's a bubble in that it's certainly the opposite thing is happening in some places.
Right.
But I think it's happening a lot more, and and it's also contested and opposed.
What do you see, Tim? What do you feel?
Wow. Yeah. I feel like I came out of white evangelical fundamentalism, so you're really taught pretty early on, your baseline is that there's only really one way.
And be suspicious of all the others.
Not even suspicious, just denigrate them.
Yes.
They're just false gods, they're false ways of being. I mean, listen, I grew up in a John MacArthur-esque type of theology, so very much tulip theology, Calvinism. And, I was taught that even the charismatics down the street were probably demonically influenced.
Yes.
And they were in the same strand of white evangelical political engagement, truly. But even they were probably under the influence of demons. And of course, a lot of those folks I learn now were taught the same thing about folks like me. I didn't have the full power of the Holy Spirit, et cetera. So it's like the Spider-Man meme where you're all pointing at each other.
Yeah.
I do think that as our world gets more interconnected, I think that at least I do. I often forget that it's almost miraculous that we can just hit a button on a slab of metal and see someone across the world on the screen in real time with no latency. Like you're just having a real conversation anywhere in the world in outer space. It's crazy. And so I think that with the rise of social media and everyone being able to have their own little platform and espousing how they see the world, it's inevitable that you start encountering different ways of existing, and you start thinking, well, it doesn't, logically it doesn't make a lot of sense. Again, I was taught that God predestined some people for heaven and the rest were left to their own devices, which is really just a way of saying that God predestined them to go to hell. Yep. And then you go, but wait, so I just hit the God jackpot out of all space and time, and every other person who doesn't see the world like me is probably going to roast forever, even though they were born in different places and in ways of understanding the world. So I think that to answer your question, I think what Iliad Delia was talking about this in her own brilliant way. I'm even going to try and summarize what she was talking about.
Yeah,
but the overall theme I heard, one of them was that religion either evolves or it dies. Yeah. We either have to start thinking about how it interacts cosmologically, how it interacts with how we think about the ideas of God. She had that what was it, like the flat Earth analogy? Then it was like the
first
axial age.
Big fan, former homeschooler here. Okay, so big fancy words for me, but exactly. And I'm like, oh yeah, we're in between this Earth-centric view and like this Big Bang way of thinking about the world and how we're all interconnected and how fancy things like quantum theory talk about that stuff. So I think that it's inevitable, but I do think that a lot of the spaces, and to be clear, religious fundamentalism is found in any religious tradition, right? Correct. Our tradition is white evangelical fundamentalism. You can find it in Islam, you can find it in Hinduism. Like it's not unique. Absolutely. But yeah, I think we're kind of in that murky in between, between either religion will die, either people will make technology their new thing, it will kind of replace the need for God. Or we really start thinking differently about maybe what God is up to and how we even conceive of the idea of God and how other new ideas like process theology and stuff can factor into that. So, yeah.
In everything Kyle said, I would confirm is true. While also I want to add in that while there's been this openness, and not even just openness, but like from the front addressing pluralism or other dipping and dabbling in other faith traditions, there's been a ton of Jesus. And even in saying why we think this could be a key to postmodern spirituality, it's because of the way of Jesus. It's because of the scriptures and the Gospels even.
Yeah, Can I say one thing? I really find the way of Jesus just utterly compelling. I just cannot shake this Jesus thing. Never could. The work I'm doing now is birthed only out of my radical allegiance to the way of Jesus, right? Mm-hmm. Which is why I left white evangelicalism, all the Trump shit. Can I curse on your podcast?
Yeah, you can.
Great. All the Trump shit, just really was like, it was, I thought because we had the same beliefs, we shared the same values, and that was not the truth. So, that's just kind of how I think about it is, I lost my train of thought completely. It just flew
Jesus
out the
drove
window.
you to
Thank
this.
You. Thank you. I got it back. Just to summarize this, what I like about this conference is that there are a lot of people who can't shake the Jesus thing. Yeah. And I like that there's a place where we can listen to Christians, Catholics, whoever, liberation theologians, also be compelled by the way of Jesus. Mm-hmm. And that compels them to open their minds to being changed by other people's perspectives and vice versa, including different faith traditions, right? But I like that for this, it's very Jesus-centric. So I think a lot of people have this misconception that when you start deconstructing or whatever the phrase is, you eventually lose the Jesus thing. And I think like for most people I talk to a lot of people. I mean, I've probably gotten 15, 20,000 DMs over the past 2.5 years. Like, that's a lot. Most people are like, there's got to be a choice, different options between white Christian nationalism or atheism. Yeah. And that's not because I think atheism can't be compelling. I mean, for sure, plenty of friends in that space, respect the hell out of them. But for me, there's something, John Dominic Crossan says that metaphors create realities. And like, even if I can't prove a physical resurrection, the belief that it happened is a beautiful, at minimum, metaphor that death does not have the final word at the end of time. Can I prove that's the case? No, but I don't care because it just gives immense meaning to how I move throughout the world, and the call to love all of our neighbors, even our enemies, I think is the solution to stopping the cycles of chaos that we see all the time. Unfortunately, in our cultural moment, it is the white evangelical framework that is the epicenter of the tornado causing so much of the chaos, right? And so I almost feel like these days we have to be like missionaries to those evangelicals, preaching the good news, that, hey, you don't have to be tribalistic anymore, like there's a better way of being that loves all their neighbors, not just your own tribe.
Yeah. Thank you. Are you satisfied with that?
I am.
Why, thank you.
I just want to get back just for briefly to finish up this kind of Brian McLaren trajectory, which kind of is, in a nutshell, all of our trajectories and how we've landed here where we are. If you could, two little bumps in that road, 2005 to where we are now, how would you characterize that? And then where do you see this going?
Yeah. I was in a restaurant late at night after some event with a bunch of the other folks in this emergent conversation, probably around 2006, 2007. And I said to them, look, we have been super fortunate. The pushback that we've gotten there's been pushback, but if we're getting pushback, it means we're getting a hearing. And this will not go well, and these doors will shut very, very soon. Or they will shut eventually, and that's what, that's what happened. And when you said about how it failed in the sense that, what did we expect? It'd be like saying, do we expect the Republican Party to say, we really should be more woke?
You got the point, guys.
Wow, we agree with you. You finally got through to us. And what we found was that in the evangelical world, the resistance was primarily ostensibly theological. Underneath, I think it was political. It had, and even deeper than politics, it had to do with patriarchy, and it had to do with white supremacy. In the mainline Protestant world, it wasn't theological; it was liturgical and hierarchical, because the things we were raising challenged the how can I say it? The rigid conformity to traditional liturgies and hierarchies.
Yes.
And in the Catholic world, there was another set of issues there. So after 2005, there was a period of years where those doors began to shut. And interestingly, technology seems to always play a role in these things. But this is also the time frame then when first blogs and then podcasts create this space where people can be driving in their cars and nobody knows who they're listening to.
Whoa, yeah. I haven't thought of that one.
And in a sense, I think what it's done is it's allowed these messages to get out farther and faster than they could have otherwise. I'll just give an example. At this event, there are a lot of people from the LDS or Mormon community, because they're having these private conversations spreading in Mormonism. And so when they find out that they won't be rejected or excluded from a gathering like this, they're like, oh, good, here's a place we can come and have more of these conversations too. So So that would be one of the stories in the years.
I like that. Yeah, I mean, when I think of bloggers, I think of Rachel Held Evans,
Yeah.
who is kind of like the grandmother of the movement
Yes.
in many ways. And then when I think of podcasts, I think of yourself, Holy Post.
Holy Post, really?
Well, I mean,
No, not a bad thing. I was just surprised. you know?
no, but
They
I
do
think
great
of
work.
Tripp and what
Yeah.
but the podcasters. I mean, that's
Yeah.
interesting that you would say bloggers and podcasters are kind of not themselves, but providing a media and an availability to this stuff that we didn't have before.
I think podcasters, bloggers and podcasters, and now YouTubers and all the rest, and TikTokers and all of
You're way
the
more
rest,
hip than I am.
There we
I
go,
think
Brian.
become the 95 Theses.
Yep.
Yeah.
But now it's 950 Theses on 950 doors, 1,000 doors,
Yeah.
and it becomes impossible to contain the spread of ideas.
Exactly.
And then what that's going to mean is that the communities that want to stay closed will have to become more and more rigid and
Yes.
controlling and domineering in order to try to keep control.
That's yes. I mean, this is why when I call it the deconstruction phenomena an explosion. It's not a movement. People are going different directions. When this thing happened online, and even when I started TNE on Instagram, I didn't know that it was happening. I was like, anyone else have questions? Boom, deconstruction. Oh, okay, I'm late to the party. But also there's other people out here, right? Yeah. But I watched, the Gospel Coalition, all kinds of really the evangelical world just spring into action. Okay, we have to really quell this, right? So here's the articles. People who are deconstructing are just trying to be hip, or they want street cred. That was what one author said. Matt Chandler said they just think it's so sexy to deconstruct. But what they underestimated was what Brian just said, is that thanks to social media, they couldn't contain the narrative.
Yes.
Right? You have these people saying, actually, Matt Chandler, I lost my faith community because I dared to ask if maybe excluding our queer neighbors isn't the right path forward. Not for a moral failing, not because I abused someone or I was having an affair or whatever. No, because I just asked if maybe God's love was more expansive than the theology I was given, and I was excommunicated and seen as the wolf in sheep's clothing, right? Meanwhile, in those spaces, we watch people like Mark Driscoll only get a larger platform, bigger than ever, almost 1 million followers now on Instagram. Meanwhile, he has 40 of his own elders who wrote a letter saying, this guy's not qualified to lead, but he's more popular. So actually what happened was that we saw the blatant hypocrisy. We saw where they drew the lines. I mean, I remember, Brian, when Rob Bell wrote Love Wins, right? And I was one of these kinds of mutts. I was reading Francis Chan, I was reading Brian, I was listening to Paul Washer's sermons. You know who Paul Washer is? Yeah, I'm like, this guy's so hardcore. I want the true gospel, right? But also Shane Claiborne's like, maybe that true gospel is social and economic justice. I'm like, oh, that's a good point. That
And they're both hardcore. What
exactly.
do I do?
Like, they're so radical. And so Rob Bell writes Love Wins, and I love Rob Bell. And I read the book. I devour it. I'm like, oh, this is... And again, I was very conservative in my theology. I was, listening to talk radio every day. It's just how I was. I was young. And I'm like, oh, this is very compelling. It was one page in one chapter of the book. Rob just asked the question, can God's love even overcome the depths of hell? I'm like, that great thought. Moving along. I go to a church a couple weeks later. They got a pamphlet. Watch out, heretical book, Rob Bell. And John Piper tweets, farewell, Rob Bell.
I still remember Mark Driscoll's words of, God is love, love is not God.
Yeah, right.
We have to make sure that you know that.
Yeah, so I think a lot of people who deconstructed in those spaces, they finally put two and two together. They're like, wait a second. If I ask questions about can God's love be more expansive, I'm the problem. Yeah. If people like Mark Driscoll abuse parishioners, have entire podcast series documenting their abuse, they're only more promoted because they're on board for this political ideology, right, of just really power and control is what it comes down to. And so I think it's really important to recognize that I think maybe one of the first times in a long time, a lot of those gatekeepers felt out of control. Yeah. So Elisa Childers, she writes The Deconstruction of Christianity. She talks to none of the people that she critiques. Well, she talked to me offline. She won't talk to me on the podcast. I've reached out to her many times. They're not interested, to your point about drawing the tighter and tighter circle. They are not interested in having any kind of good faith dialogue. And I know this because I've reached out to all of them, and they know who I am. I'm like, Elisa, we could do it privately. I will talk to you off the record. No response. And what they're doing is they're essentially giving red meat to their base to give them the justification to keep thinking that the term deconstruction is so problematic and postmodern and it's Jacques Derrida, blah, 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 blah. they're not actually interested in thinking beyond their own paradigm. And frankly, I think people more and more are realizing this, and they're leaving. Statistically, white evangelicalism is shrinking, but it's becoming more radicalized. And that's to be expected, because as a group thinks that they're losing, as a group realizes they're losing privilege, they mistake that for like a right. Persecution, exactly. And they only become more and more antagonistic, So it's very fascinating to witness in real time who they tolerate, who's allowed in their spaces, and then who they kick out, and then the mechanisms that they have in place to defend the in-group from now the new out-group.
Yeah. I mean, you talking, Tim, Brian, us having these conversations, it's so easy to look at what we're doing and think that, and not see the forest for the trees, right? And just see, I'm a pastor, so I'm on the ground with people, trying to pastor, trying to bring people into following Jesus as best we can. And it's easy to just get caught up in that activity, which is really life-giving, beautiful activity, I think. However, having the theologians and the historians and the podcasters and the cultural observers among us who can say, this is the moment that we find ourselves in the history of the church. And when you do that, you discover we're in a really, really fascinating place in church history right now, right? Like, we're right in the middle of it. Yeah. These conversations are crafting in some ways. So we all have places to go and seminars to jump into after this. Where do you see this going, Brian? If you could give us a couple of, I hate bullet points with every fiber of my beating, but if there are a couple of bullet points of this is what I see on the horizon.
Well, no, 3 points. They must all start with B or A. Or C,
yeah. You're a good evangelical. Yep.
That could be a great improv game. Yeah. The letter Q. You have to start.
Yeah.
So I think we should expect opposite things to happen, and we shouldn't forget one because its opposite is happening. I think forms of Christianity will become uglier than they've ever been. I think we should expect we are not anywhere near the bottom. Yes. I was just mentioning this to Tim. I highly recommend people read or listen to Rachel Maddow's book, Prequel, which is a history of the 1930s. Have you?
No, you mentioned it in your little seminar.
Yeah.
Not little, that sounded...
How patronizing.
In that cute little seminar.
Adorable, Brian, adorable.
But she tells the story of the 1930s and how the most popular radio show in the 1930s was a Catholic priest who was an anti-Semite fascist, pro-Nazi, pro-Hitler guy. The most popular radio show in the 1930s. Wow. There was a group in the 1930s I'd never heard of called the Christian Front that was a Hitler-funded pro-Nazi movement.
In America.
And it was a big deal. And they came very close to, they had they had armed militia. They had members of the military who were helping them steal weapons so they could prepare for civil war. How did I never learn about this?
Wow.
Can you invite Rachel to be on our podcast?
Yeah.
Someone's got to have her number, right?
My pal Rachel. But at any rate, and people can listen to that or listen to that book on audio or read it, and at the end they'll just realize these are not new things.
Yeah.
So, in fact, to me, these are two poles of American history from the very, very beginning. And so I think we should expect all of that stuff to get worse because people are desperate and people are afraid and people can make money. And wherever people can make money, expect it to happen. And then I think as that gets uglier and uglier, we should expect good people to say, I can't be part of this anymore. And they will either be given a better alternative or they won't.
Yep.
Yeah.
So that's one thing I would expect. I think the same thing will happen in secularism. I think in the secular world, there will be people who see the mess we're in and say, we got to find a good way forward. And I think, I remember reading an article. I was present in Charlottesville in 2017. I was part of the clergy counter-protest there. And so I read an article a few days after that, and a former member of a white supremacist group said, you think the religious right is ugly. Wait until you see the secular right. Because what they will do is they will to find meaning, belonging, and purpose, there will be people who embrace white nationalism. It won't be white Christian nationalism, and maybe the word Christian will still be used, but it will be a very, very ugly narrative, and that's happening.
Yeah,
it's happening today in the middle of this. So all this say we should expect uglier things to happen, and we should expect more beautiful things to happen, and it will give all of us a choice. The other thing I'd say going forward is I think the climate crisis will get worse every single year. I think we should assume that in general, every year that we live is the coolest year we will live for the rest of our lives.
So crazy.
And
wow.
Hurricanes and floods and fires, and the number of days that people can't work outdoors, and insurance crises, and mass migrations. I think we should expect these things to increase, and I think that will increase desperation and anger and pushback and denial and everything. I think it will just intensify everything, and I think a spirituality. People will be crying for a spirituality that teaches us to love the earth and to love our fellow humans and to love our fellow living creatures and to love the systems that sustain them, to love all of this as part of one integrated whole. And I think there will be Jewish versions of that and Muslim versions of it and non-religious versions of it and Christian versions of it in many other communities too. Yeah, that's what I think.
Yeah, kind of bring us full circle, talking about the pluralism or the dabbling in other traditions, the unification of our world in the second axial moment,
age.
whatever it is. I have
third. It's the third.
We're in the
Ilya
third.
talks about.
good thing we got some people with letters behind their name.
Yeah.
Brian McLaren, Tim Whitaker from the New Evangelicals podcast. You got something
I
else,
want to answer
Tim?
your question.
Okay. Oh, thank you. Yes, you too. Thank you.
Just because.
Damn it.
I just want to reinforce, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but Brian is completely right that we have not reached the bottom. I mean, the people that are out there, if your audience doesn't know names like Doug Wilson, Joel Webbin, William Wolf, Russ Vaught, people behind Project 2025, if people aren't aware that J.D. Vance is on organizational boards that Doug Wilson is on, it is not good.
Let me ask my slightly hopeful but cynical version or question. Do you think that exists mostly on Christian Twitter, or is that real life shit?
No, this is real life shit. Okay. I mean, and this is kind of like my wheelhouse because I've been spending so much time over the past couple of years really trying to get my handle around what is Christian nationalism and how deep is it and how serious is it? Because one thing I don't want to sound like is a talk radio host. I don't want to sound like Glenn Beck when Obama got elected as he's crying on air. Literally, I remember this vividly. He's crying. We're going to have an America in 4 years. He's a socialist. I'm just like, all right. So I don't want to sound like that, which is why I always try and have receipts. This is why I go to Turning Point USA events. I meet Charlie Kirk, and I spend 4 or 5 days there making content on it. So I want to hear, okay, what are they actually advocating for? What's their actual motivation? Yes, it's very real. Lance Wallnow, the Seven Mountain Mandate. Luckily, there are amazing scholars doing fucking great work. Matthew Taylor, Catherine Stewart, Kristen Dumais, Jamar Tisby, Robbie Jones, Diana Butler-Bass. We can go down. Andrew Whitehead, Anthea Butler. We can go down the list. They are doing great work because I don't think the average American, including mainstream media, really understands the religious zealotry that animates white Christian nationalism. And to Brian's point, this is not the first time in the merry-go-round. Another great book is called Fever in the Heartland. Great history of the KKK, the 1920s, 1930s. It's the same shit, man. We're on a merry-go-round for sure. So I hate to make your audience sound depressed, but I do that to motivate them to get up off their asses and to get involved. Yeah. And that's just some straight Jersey talk. I'm from New Jersey. We just talk blunt. It's like instead of doom and gloom, get educated, get involved in local politics, know who the players are. If you're a rich millionaire or billionaire, please fund some of these organizations. Wink, wink, we're a nonprofit. There's a podcast that I'm on that could probably use some funding, support it because it's a red alert moment. If Trump gets in to office, genuinely very concerned, not because of Trump, but because of who he would bring into his administration. One of the textbook moves of more authoritarianism or fascist ideology is to use democratic levers to dismantle democratic norms. And this has been done in Hungary. This is being done in Italy. It's here in the U.S. So the good news. The good news, I think, again, to Ryan's point, is that there are a lot of people who see it and are like, what the fuck did I sign up for? Because this ain't it. Mm-hmm. And I think that Christians, especially people like me who grew up white evangelical, maybe unintentionally part of the system, didn't really know how deep we were in, now we're kind of out. I feel like people like us have to be the loudest canaries in the coal mine. It shouldn't be up to our black neighbors, our queer neighbors. It should be up to them because they're the targets. Yeah. There is an inherent James Tellerico, he doesn't call it privilege. He calls it something else. I'll call it privilege. But there's an inherent white privilege, especially as a man, because these spaces were built for us. So I can go to Turning Point USA and be a bro-evangelical and we can talk because it's cool, but my queer friends can't do that, But that allows us to be able to do content and to raise the alarm of hey, here's what's going on. Yeah. And then how do we create or how do we dream of who are the theologians or whoever, the ethicists, et cetera, who can give us better language to really think about that better path forward, right? It was something that Adam Clark said in his session today, which, by the way, Adam Clark is just so top tier. He said that essentially that power structures make those at the top, make those at the bottom subhuman, and those at the top inhuman. And I was like, oh, that's so good.
That's really good.
That is so good. And how the gospel, for lack of a better term, the good news, affects both, but very differently. Mm-hmm. It's a different message. And so I never had that language before, but now I do. And now I'm going to start using that in my content, Yeah. So I think that there is a lot of beauty to come out of this, but there's also a lot of ashes that are happening, and it's painful. Mm-hmm. And we have to do all that we can to protect whatever we have of this democratic experiment and to keep pushing for a realized democratic process that protects the rights of all of our neighbors, especially the most marginalized.
In a Christianity that includes all of them.
All of them. Yeah. Love your neighbor as yourself, right? And we love God by loving our neighbors. This is very simple, right? But for some reason, our evangelical theology is well, maybe toxic empathy is a thing, or maybe we can't love all of our neighbors. When you think about it, what the fuck? We love our neighbors as ourselves. It's 101 Christian thinking. So it's not radical to me.
Yep. Yeah. One more question, maybe 3 minutes max. Do you have that? Mm-hmm. I'm gonna shit on all of our parades here.
I did that.
We're not going to be able to talk to you in about a month, but in about a month, we're going to either be really excited or not excited at all. So let's just imagine this is early December, month and a half from now, whatever that is, and Trump won. A good amount of our listeners will be dealing with the ramifications of that. Yes. Fast forward to that, get yourself in that, if you can, into that reality. We've all felt it before. What's some guidance and wisdom and counsel you have for us, our listeners, who are dealing with that reality, Brian?
Yes. So I would say if you can, take a walk or sit down at a quiet place or find a friend you trust and have a conversation where you talk about what it will feel like. In other words, in advance. Play the scenario out in advance and say, if he wins. By the way, him winning isn't the only scary outcome. One outcome is that we won't know who won because people will interfere. We got to play forth those scenarios and say, okay, how do we want to? Let's imagine that could happen. Let's prepare our nervous system.
It's probably going to happen. Right.
Yeah. And then I think here's my little mantra that's helping me. I say, I don't know what the future holds, but I know how I want to show up. Mm. And I want to show up in ways that will invite my neighbors who share my disdain for all that, this ugliness that's happening. I want to show up for them. I want to help us pull together and say our job hasn't changed. We've got to love our neighbors, and this is our reality. I might want to show up to say to people, sometimes things have to get a lot worse before they get a lot better. Mm. And I want to figure out, how do I want to show up for my neighbors who are Trump supporters and will be super, super happy? How do I want to show up for them? Would I want to show up and tell them I hate them and I'm disgusted with them? Do I want to show up and say, I can imagine you feel really, really happy right now. I want you to know I feel really terrible right now. And you might be happy that I feel terrible. You might not, but I want you to know I feel terrible. Yeah. If you're interested in why, I'll be glad to tell you.
Yeah.
And I think, but to play forward, how do we want to show up?
Tim.
Amen.
Yeah. Thank you. Brian McLaren, Tim Whitaker, thanks for making space for us.
Thank you for inviting me. It's great.
Thank you, guys. Keep up the great work.